What's up, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Killer Brews, the show where beer and fear collide. First off, I'd like to say I apologize for taking such a long break between episodes. I've had a lot going on between work and home, but now that I have a little bit of free time, I'm hoping to catch up, do a few more videos, and keep this series moving along as well. For those of you that may be new to the program, Killer Brews is basically a combination of two of my favorite interests, one being craft beer and the other being the study of serial killers. So, for those of you who maybe haven't seen any of the other videos, I'm actually a criminal justice professor who teaches a broad range of courses. I do policing, comparative criminal justice, I do classes on the courts. But my favorite class, and probably the most popular one that I do, is serial killers. There's a broad interest from all kinds of academic majors. Most of my classes fill up with criminal justice students. This is the one class that draws from everything: psychology, biology, pharmacy. You get a little bit of everybody. So obviously there's some interest to it. The one thing that I'm going to try to do a little bit differently, there are lots of people that do great serial killer videos on YouTube and other places on the internet. But what I'm hoping to do is kind of bring a little bit of an academic approach to this, as well as, get into eventually some serial killers and we'll talk about their exploits. But before we do that, I kind of want to go over this framework that we use to study serial killers in my classes. And basically, there are a number of different academics out there that put forward ways to study serial killers, but the approach I use is one put forward by the Holmeses. They're a pair of professors that basically put together a, process to analyze and categorize serial killers. So if you've seen the earlier videos, we talked about mission killers, visionary killers. Today we're going to move on to the category of hedonistic serial killers. And there's going to be three subsets here: hedonistic thrill, hedonistic lust, and then the comfort killer. So we'll talk about each of those individually. Along the way, we'll also do a beer review. Today is a very hot day. It's 90 plus degrees out here in the beer shed, and I'm trying to hold it down. I'll try to get through the first category before I crack into this beer, but depending on how hot it is, I might have to jump into it a little bit sooner, right? It's a bit sweltering out here. All right, anyway, we'll move on to the first category, and this is going to be one umbrella with three subcategories kind of under it, and then for the hedonistic comfort, there'll be two categories under that. So I'm going to try to keep it neat and orderly if I can, and hopefully, everybody can follow along. So the lust killer is kind of unique, hedonistic lust killers, in that basically sexual gratification is their goal and the reason why they engage in serial murder. One thing that's kind of interesting, at least to me, is kind of the element or aspect of fantasy that comes into play here. So a lot of times serial killers will have this idealized vision of what a kill is going to be like. They work it up in their head and you think about it for quite a while. And then lo and behold, usually when you actually go to engage in the murder, it doesn't live up to whatever your fantasy was. And, you could probably take that and apply it to other aspects of life, right? Even outside of the serial killer realm, when we fantasize about things, we have this idealized version in our heads of how things are going to go. And, very rarely do real life events live up to that fantasy. So you'll kind of find that element with them. And what's also kind of interesting is these guys will generally kill until they can't kill. And there are a number of reasons why they may stop. One would be that sex is no longer important. So obviously there's a biological timeline to all of us. When we're younger and more virile, sex tends to be more important. As you get older, you may have problems, maybe impotency or whatever it might be. But you may have problems kind of engaging in sexual activity, or maybe the desire simply isn't what it used to be when you were a younger person. Now, for the most part, when we're dealing with these killers, they're overwhelmingly males. Not to say there aren't any females, but overwhelmingly males. So most of the time when I'm discussing hedonistic lust, it'll probably be in terms of male serial killers, and simply because that's what we're dealing with in the majority here. So when do they stop? One, when sex is no longer important. Two, when selection of a suitable victim is not available. There could be a number of reasons why the ideal victim is not available. Say, each of us has our own, desires or traits in a partner that we find attractive. Some people might look for hair color, could be your build, could be race, could be, whatever type of employment. I know in the past people have fantasized about police officers, nurses, all kinds of different professions. So serial killers are no different in that there's something that they find particularly attractive about the victim. So what that means is they'll strike if someone who strikes their fancy or fits whatever their desire is, in this category, they'll strike and victimize that kind of person. But if that person's not available, they generally won't. So if you're a serial killer that's interested in teenage girls, right? It's a common group that's targeted. And there are no teenage girls available. All you see is an old folks home or a kindergarten. Odds are the killer won't strike at that point just because this isn't particularly what they find appealing. Now, another reason why they might not strike is they're incapacitated. So serial killers, not surprisingly, engage in all kinds of, bizarre and terrible behaviors. Many of them engage in things other than murder. So it's not unheard of for serial killers to engage in, say, other types of assaults, whether they be sexual or just physical assaults, may engage in burglary or petty theft or any other type of crime, drug possession, etc. So occasionally a serial killer might get caught, might be tried, convicted, and incarcerated for a crime other than the serial murders. So if the person is in prison, if your ideal victim type is teenage girls or young women, and you're in a prison full of men, clearly you're not going to be able to strike. You won't be able to engage in these activities because you don't have access to the ideal victim type. Now, imprisonment's not the only reason. It could be that the person is incapacitated. Maybe they're in the military, right? You signed up for the Army, signed up for the Marine Corps, whatever it might be. You're shipped out to some kind of base or sent over to the Middle East or wherever they send soldiers nowadays. Maybe you can't strike because of the nature of your work. You live a more regimented life. If you disappear for long periods of time, people will notice. There are a number of different reasons why you may become kind of incapacitated. But the general idea here is serial killers that engage in this type of crime aren't going to stop until either they can't perform or there's some other reason why they can't continue on engaging in serial murder. So once you cross that threshold between fantasy and reality, they tend to stay there, right? They tend to continue killing until caught incapacitated or sex is no longer important. Now, when we deal with the motivations, why do people engage in this type of activity? There tends to be two options here, intrinsic or extrinsic. Intrinsic means there's something within the psyche of the serial killer, that pushes them to engage in this type of activity. So if we're dealing with hedonistic lust killers, why do they do it? They're basically in it for personal gratification. In this instance, it's going to be personal sexual gratification, but it's something inherent in the person that's driving them to engage in this type of activity. The anticipated gain, what does the killer hope to get out of this? Realization of the fantasy. Now, in reality, they're never really going to do that, right? You're never really going to get that fulfillment, but they're going to keep trying. They're going to keep engaging in these activities, trying to reach that, the fulfillment of the fantasy, whether or not it actually happens or not. So that's kind of important. So as to the homicidal behavior patterns, victim selectivity, we mentioned this in one of the earlier videos. Serial killers tend to have ideal victim types, so something about the victim that makes them particularly attractive. Why this is important is because it deals with this concept, and I think I dealt with this in the first video, about serial killer myths. Not everybody is at the same risk of being victimized by a serial killer. For the most part, healthy men, physically active men are less likely to be targeted than females. Elderly women or young children are less likely to be targeted. When we deal with, if you had to say what's the most common age range for serial killers, probably late teens through 20s females. What does that mean? That group of individuals within society is at higher risk for being targeted than others. So me as a 40-some-year-old male, the odds of me being targeted are not very high. So when we talk about ideal victim type, it's important because when we're trying to potentially decide who might be a victim, you want to look at who's the ideal victim type to figure out what group of individuals or what cross section of society is being targeted. So for lust killers, there's going to be something they find attractive about the victim. Now, again, this could be a physical attribute. So maybe it's race, physical size, hair color, eye color. Maybe it's something, a condition of employment, something they do. So again, maybe they're attracted to nurses or firefighters or police officers or prostitutes. Could be anything. Whatever the group of individuals is that they find attractive is generally who they target. So it's not random people. It's not going to just be anyone, right? I mean, it's going to be someone who falls into this category for the most part. One thing to keep in mind is when we're dealing, again, this is, again, broad generalizations. When we're dealing with these types of serial killers, they tend to kill people who are strangers. Now, that doesn't mean that they're going to be random. It doesn't mean that they'll have no idea who the victims are. It might be somebody they've been stalking. It might be somebody they're casually acquainted with, or maybe you just recognize them from the neighborhood or from town. But usually it's not going to be someone you've developed a close relationship or bond with. So very rarely will it be a family member, husband or wife, close friend, something like that, right? All right. As far as crime scene traits, there are a number of things that we could look for here. That would help us analyze crime scenes and maybe figure out what category a serial killer could fit into. So when we deal with the crime scene, one of the first two things we'll talk about is that it's generally going to be a controlled crime scene. So what this means is the serial killer is not going to let things fall to chance, right? They're going to be very careful in the tools or implements they select. They're going to be careful in choosing the place where the crime occurs. And within the crime scene, you'll see signs of order generally. It's not going to be just chaotic, letting things fall to chance, hoping you find a weapon. You're probably not going to see that. And it kind of goes into, all this preparation and development of the fantasy. As you develop the fantasy, you think, okay, how do I want to do this? What tools or implements will I use? What will I need to clean up this scene or dispose of a body? And for those reasons, it's usually a controlled crime scene. The other thing you probably won't find is overkill, and this is something that should be elaborated on a bit. Overkill basically means using more force than is necessary to dispatch a victim. Okay. Now this can be very confusing because sometimes you may see a body after the person's been killed that's gone through terrible abuse. The body may have been dismembered or all kinds of other things, burned in attempts to conceal or dispose of the body, whatever it is, right? It might be some effort to get rid of it. And I think when people see that, they automatically think, aha, this is overkill, and it's not. And I'll tell you why. The damage that's been done here is post-mortem, so it's after they're dead. When we talk about overkill, you're dealing with more force than is needed to kill the victim. So very frequently, when you talk about homicides, when you see overkill, in many instances, it's an indication that it's someone that the victim knows. Reason being, if I'm Bill the burglar and I climb into your window at 2 a.m. to snatch your TV, and you come, ambling down the stairs, and you startle me, what's the burglar likely to do? Maybe they shoot you once, climb out the window, and try to get away, right? They're very rarely going to stab you 130 times or shoot you repeatedly, because the idea is what the killer is trying to do, the killer in this instance, I guess, or the thief, is they're trying to get away, trying to make their egress and escape. And the violence is just a way to kind of put distance between the victim and the individual, or maybe it is to cover up their tracks if they think that the witness saw them. Now, overkill's different. Overkill is when you act with anger and rage and you stab the victim 132 times. Is the victim probably dead after the first 10 or 12 stab wounds? Yeah. Do you need to stab them 130 times? No. Why do you do it? Because you're angered, you're enraged, you're lashing out, and your focus is on inflicting as much damage as you can. So when you look at damage to a murder victim, one thing you'd want to keep in mind is it post-mortem or is it done while the victim is still alive? If it's done, contemporaneously or after they die, it's probably not going to be overkill, right? If it happens contemporaneously, it will be overkill. If it happens after, it's not going to be overkill. All right. Next thing, evidence of torture. Yes, you're going to see this here. For the most part, these types of serial killers will probably have some ritualistic fantasy about the way they engage in these crimes. So there is a good chance that you will see torture here. You will see them abuse the body in a number of different ways. So it could be sexual or physical, just other types of physical abuse. They might even engage in object penetration, abusing the person while they're alive, and they're experiencing all these kind of terrible things. Now, the one thing that should be noted, and this is kind of the key element of hedonistic lust killers, is that they tend to engage in necrophilia. Now, this is distinctly different than hedonistic thrill killers that need an alive victim in order to get some kind of gratification. So the idea here is hedonistic lust killers, obviously, they'll abduct somebody. They'll probably engage in some sort of sexual abuse. And then even once they're dead, they'll continue using the body for sexual purposes. Now, again, the key thing here is that this is a control issue, right? People that engage in these types of crimes want to control the victim. So I control them while they're alive. I control any pain that's inflicted on them. I control how and when they die. And even when you're dead, you're not free. I'm still in control. I determine where the body is. I determine how I decide to use the body once the victim's deceased. And it's kind of this total possession. You could say it's total degradation of the victim, because even in death, they're not free. But it's also control, because you're thoroughly in control of the victim, alive and dead. So that's kind of unique. See what else we have here. Methods of murder. Lust killers tend to get up close and personal. So that means that they're probably going to engage in manual strangulation, or if they decide to use a weapon, it'll probably be something like a knife, right? So you can be up close, personal, skin-to-skin contact. And again, if you think about the murder as an extension of some kind of sexual act, it kind of makes sense, right? They want that close contact. They want to see the victim's eyes when they're doing these types of things, and they want to be up close and personal. Murder locations, they select victims from a relatively small range of locations. And again, you may find, again, these are relatively intelligent serial killers in many instances, so you may find that they'll travel, maybe one, to select an ideal victim, or two, to throw the police off. While policing has grown by leaps and bounds, and there's a lot more information sharing than there was in years past, sometimes police are a little slower to put two and two together if a crime isn't committed in the same geographic area. So one thing to kind of think about is, if you had a body pop up in your county, the police would take notice. If you had two or three, they definitely take notice. Now, maybe if you spread them out, so different counties, different states, different regions, the police might be less likely to tie them together and realize that they've got a serial offender on their hands. So that's one of the reasons that they may travel. The other thing that's kind of, I guess, unique here or interesting is that these types of killers tend to dump the bodies in multiple locations. Sometimes you'll find serial killers that have what they call a graveyard, so they may dump all the victims in one place. Now, if you think about this logically, if the hedonistic lust killer wishes to engage in necrophilia, one of the things they're essentially trying to do is spread out the bodies so they can access them, right? So, this is a bizarre analogy, but if you think about, financial situations, a lot of people have a retirement account. You might have different bank accounts. Maybe you invest in silver and gold. Maybe you have some stocks and bonds. And the idea is the same. You want to minimize risk, and you want to protect your assets. And it's the same kind of mindset here. To these types of killers, the body is a valuable commodity, right? Even once they're dead, they'll revisit the body and engage in sexual activities with the body. So if you dump everything or all the people in one place, and somebody, the fishermen, the kids out driving their bicycles, stumble across the dumping ground, you essentially lose all of the bodies. So, there's I guess a tactical element to it, to spreading out the bodies, so that even if one of your locations is stumbled across, you have other options and you can revisit these other places. So we'll kind of keep that in mind. Let's see what else we got here. Murder locations. They tend to kill in a comfort zone. Now, what's kind of neat or unique is what serial killers consider their comfort zone varies from killer to killer. Now, it can be in your neighborhood, town, whatever your general geographic region. And the idea is you're familiar with this area. So if you want to abduct somebody, you know which streets to take, which are kind of most likely to avoid the police. If you're going to dump a body, you're probably operating in an area where you're familiar with, so you know you don't go carting a body off into the local fishing hole, or the place where all the high school kids go and drink beer. You don't want to be driving up the road where everybody's waiting for you when you go to dump a body. So serial killers tend to act within their comfort zone, so they tend to know where they want to go. Now, it could be a mobile comfort zone. It could be an area where you live, could be where you go to school or where you work. In some strange instances, you may even modify something like a vehicle to make it your killing zone. So if you're a truck driver who travel all over the country, and your zone of comfort happens to be the bed of your truck and whatever the extended area there, even though you're geographically transient, you're moving around, you're stable in that this is the area where you operate and where you're comfortable. So kind of keep that in mind. Let's see what else we have here. That's about it as far as the first category. I think we'll jump into the beer review, as I'm probably going to have a heat stroke because it's about 95 degrees in this cabin. The beer that I chose to do today is called Hike Camp, and this is Findlay Brewing Company right here in Findlay, Ohio. Now, I carefully chose this can of beer because it's called Hike Camp, and I'm a child of the 80s, and before I started learning about serial killers and the terrible exploits, the thing that they've done in reality, I kind of watched those movies. A lot of people my age did. So I grew up with Friday the 13th. I, watched all of the Nightmare on Elm Street films. And as this is called Hike Camp, and many people that tend to be targeted in those films were hikers or campers, hey, it seemed fitting. And this is a Kolsch style beer here. This comes in at 5.4 ABV, 22 IBUs. And we got a little beer blurb on the back. We'll try to read through the sweat on the can. You ever have one of those days? One of those days? If today is that day, Hike Camp is here for you. Hike Camp is the traditional Kolsch style beer brewed with German Pilsner malts and Herbschutt hops. Hirschbruck hops. This one is instantly crisp and pleasant with the light golden color. Prost, which is German for cheers. Let's give this bad boy a shot. I don't think I've ever wanted a beer where filming a video more than today. Now, as far as the color, have that nice light straw color. You can see straight through it. This is kind of crystal clear. Ton of carbonation in there. Looks quite nice. As far as the head, I'm probably dealing with, I gave it a little bit of a vigorous pour, at least 2 fingers. Nice frothy white head. That's quite inviting on a day like this. Smell, kind of like light cracker malt. Slightly fruity. Got a really nice scent to it. Let's give it a chance. I would say it is medium light bodied. I think you pick up the malt once again. It's kind of a light malt taste, nothing too crazy going on. There you pick up a little bit of fruitiness, very, very light bitterness, if any. And maybe like a sweet, maybe a little bit of a lemony taste to it, kind of like a little fruitiness to it. This isn't a huge bold beer. This isn't a dark beer. It's 15% ABV. This doesn't have all kinds of crazy adjuncts in it. This is a simple style done well. Kolsch's are one of my favorite beers, especially on a hot day. And I've talked to a number of breweries. It's a simple style, but if you mess up, you'll know it immediately, right? Because there's so few things that go into it that if you screw one of them up, something's out of whack. The minute you sip it, you know. This has been artfully crafted. This is done very well. You pick up the malt, you get a tiny, tiny bit of bitterness. You get kind of that nice fruity taste. On a hot summer's day, this is exactly what the doctor ordered. And I wish I had 2 or 3 more of them out here right now. So as far as the rating goes, Findlay Brewing, you would get a big thumbs up. I would certainly drink another one of these. Perfect beer for a day like to this. So cheers. All right. Let's move on to the next category, and this is going to be the thrill killers. Hedonistic thrill killers are different than hedonistic lust, and there's one major thing that you should focus on. Hedonistic thrill killers need a living victim, right? So what does that mean? Once the victim is dead, they're not interested. They're not into necrophiliac. So if you see necrophilia, you're not going to be dealing with a thrill killer, right? What you want here, if you're a hedonistic thrill killer, is an alive victim. The thing that does it for you, if you will, is seeing the fear and apprehension in the eyes of the victim, right? That's what they want. They get sexual gratification out of your pleading for your life, your crying, your bargaining, praying to God, whatever it is. So that's kind of the distinct nature of the hedonistic thrill killer as opposed to hedonistic lust. All right, let's see what else we have. They're going to be process focused. We talked about this in one of the earlier videos, the act versus process focus thing. If you're act focused, your primary concern is dispatching the video. You don't put a lot of time or effort into prolonging the victim's death. You don't get any gratitude out of that. Where here you find that they do get gratification from actually inflicting pain on the victim. So that's what we're dealing with here. So it's kind of unique. You're going to see them engage in quite a bit of torture. And they're probably going to drag it out as much as they can. That might mean that they actually choke a victim out or push them just to the brink of death, revive them and bring them back so that they can engage in this kind of behavior again and prolong it for as long as they can, right? So, be attentive when you're looking at that. Motivation, again, this is going to be intrinsic. There's something within the killer that makes them psychologically and sexually attracted or turns them on by watching somebody in a state of fear or apprehension, right? So it's something within them. Anticipated gain is going to be the fulfillment of the psychological or sexual desire to engage in this type of activity. So the anticipated gain is within the serial killer. Let's see what else we have here. Victim selectivity. Again, thrill killer does have an ideal victim type, same as a lust killer did. And for the same reasons, there's something they find appealing about the victim, and they're basically going to strike someone who falls into that category. Now, where it might differ a little compared to some of the other types of serial killers, is these folks will frequently engage in stalking. So when we say that the victims are random, they're not completely random in that they're just some person you just happen to run into. In many instances, not all, but in many instances, you're going to see some degree of stalking. And again, this kind of plays into the fantasy element of all this stuff, right? So there could be some degree of stalking involved. As far as crime scene traits, this will be a controlled crime scene. You're probably not going to see overkill. And again, we talked about that before. They might engage in all kinds of horrible stuff kind of prior to inflict pain and fear on the person. But once they kill them, they're not going to continue stabbing them or doing things like that. Because once they're dead and life passes from their eyes, the killer doesn't really get a whole lot out of it sexually, so it no longer piques their interest, if you will. As to the crime scene, it's not going to be chaotic. They're going to take a fair amount of preparation as they prepare for the kill, and they'll bring the implements with them. They'll take care in plotting and planning what they're going to do, so you're really not going to see chaotic crime scenes. Evidence of torture for the most part, yes. Specific victims, yes. They have an IVT. Weapons at the scene, for the most part, no. And again, if you have this fantasy of how you're going to inflict fear and pain on someone, you're probably going to be sure you know what you want to do that, and you're not going to leave it up to chance. As far as the sexual elements, aberrant sexual activity, yes. They'll probably strangle the victim. There'll probably be some degree of sexual assault with the person themselves, their body, or with foreign objects. They may use that as part of the intimidation or fear or degradation of the victim. So you'll probably see all those types of things. Now, the one big difference is going to be necrophilia. You're generally not going to see that whatsoever because it's hard to get fear or apprehension from a dead person, right? All right, let's see. Methods of murder. Usually not an overkill. We kind of hit on that. Carefully select tools. We talked on that. Here's one thing. They may actually even record the activities. So there may be some degree of video recording or audio recording so they can relive the kill at a later date. So if you do, physically video record an assault and a murder, they might watch it again so they can relive, the torment that the victim suffered through. So that's kind of the elements that we look for in a hedonistic thrill type killer. Now, on to the final one, and this is going to be the comfort killer, and these are kind of unique. They're not really like the other killers in that they're not killing for any kind of sexual gratification. They're killing for some sort of financial benefit. Now, that could mean life insurance. Maybe you kill your business partner so you can take over the business. Whatever it is, but you're trying to maintain your lifestyle and you're killing for some sort of property, right? Whether it's real property, whether it's cash, whether it's insurance payouts or whatever. But there's something like that that's going to motivate the killer. Now, what's kind of interesting here is when we deal with serial killers in general, overwhelming majority are males, probably 95% or more. Of the small amount of females that engage in serial killer, most of them would engage in this type. So this is probably the group where females are most represented. Now, it doesn't mean it's only females. Plenty of guys doing this as well. But historically, I think we tended to see more females engage in this type of behavior. And a lot of it would have been what they call black widows years ago. So maybe I'm a young lady, I marry a wealthy man, I then slowly poison him, he dies, I collect the house, the money, the payoff, whatever it may be. Eventually you probably run out of money, and then you have to rinse, lather, repeat, do this again, right? So you marry somebody else, knock them off, collect the money. Now, you don't really see that as much as you used to in years past because insurance companies, the police, and forensic evidence and medicine, all that, if you start to have multiple husbands or wives dying via arsenic poisoning, someone's probably going to catch on that something's going on here. The other thing that's kind of unique is they tend to avoid overt, violent displays. So in many instances, they'll attempt to kind of conceal the murder or hide the true cause of death. And when we talked about the poisoning, obviously you might see that. You're rarely going to come and just pour a bottle of rat killer into or Drano into my drink, which I die and they'll figure it out immediately. It tends to be more slower over an extended period of time. And it's not necessarily to drag it out or hurt the victim, but to conceal the reality of what's going on. Motivation, this is kind of unique. This would be the only category where it's extrinsic. So they're not necessarily killing because they get something psychological, sexual from the kill. It's just a means to an end, right? This is how I go about getting the money I need to maintain my lifestyle. Now, what's kind of interesting is these are sociopathic individuals. And you can kind of understand this because most serial killers kind of select people, I don't want to say randomly, but they're not people that they know. Even if there's some degree of stalking, they're not killing family members or anyone you have an intimate relationship, where these people tend to do that almost exclusively. So it's the opposite. Now, I'm not kind of trying to split hairs here. Killing anyone is terrible and horrible, right? But I think most people would say if you develop a relationship, establish trust, go through this, the timely elements of courting someone, marrying them, and then killing them, or developing a very close personal business bond with somebody and then killing them, it's a little bit different, right? It's a lot more personal. For that reason, I think that they're somewhat unique. So that's kind of a little bit different, I think. Now, like I said, motivation is going to be extrinsic. Anticipated gains, it's pretty straightforward. Money in one way, shape, or form, right? So whether it's houses, insurance, cars, gold doubloons, whatever you got, it's money. Homicidal victim behavioral patterns. Now, again, victim selectivity, they're unique in that they kill non-strangers. And I'm not to say they're the only people that kill non-strangers, but they tend to exclusively focus on non-strangers. Non-random, obviously. People are very carefully selected. This isn't just, hey, let's hope we find someone who kind of fits the physical appearance I like. They've got to put in a lot of time. Is this someone that has the financial means to what I desire, right? And if you do, then they, again, go through all these steps that could take weeks, months, even years to develop these relationships before they strike. So that's kind of unique. Murder locations, they tend to be geographically stable. For the most part, they tend to kill in and around the home. Now, not always. I mean, obviously, there's more ways to kill somebody than poisoning. So, say for example, I decide to go on a hiking trip with my wife in the Rocky Mountains, and we're up on the cliffs, and I go to take a selfie. My wife could push me off the edge, right? And I'd plummet down the hill and meet my demise. Now, obviously, it's not done in the home, but it's very selective in where you choose to strike and when you choose to strike. So, when you deal with the geography, it tends to be more on the stable side than just kind of random wherever you run into somebody, usually very carefully planned. Now, the other thing that's kind of unique here is that there's a couple of subtypes within the comfort killer umbrella, and this would be the killer of affiliate victims and the killer of strangers. Now, the killers of affiliate victims are, I think, what we traditionally think of as comfort killers. And again, these would be the Black Widow type folks that establish relationships and dispatch their husband, wife, business partner, whoever, for financial gain. And that's pretty straightforward there. Now, the other category would be hitmen. Hitmen tend to kill strangers, right? Or at least they're not selecting them for some of the reasons many of the others do. They're definitely killing for financial gain. In most instances, you're paid by a crime syndicate or someone else to engage in this type of activity. So there is a financial element to it. But what's kind of different here, this all changed, I guess, when Richard Kuklinski became kind of famous. So if you're not familiar with him, he's the Iceman. There are a number of videos all over the internet. He did a series of interviews with HBO. And it was really interesting, but like most serial killers, there's probably aspects of truth and some lies mixed into the interviews. You'll probably find that when you deal with serial killers, these people are professional liars. Why? Because you have to separate your serial killing and your everyday life. For most people, if you killed someone, you'd be a physical mess. You wouldn't be able to sleep. You'd probably have problems with relationships with your family. But the Iceman was able to kind of compartmentalize these things. He could put them to the side, and from all accounts, seemed to be a decent father for the most part. I'm sure everybody's got some problems, but he was able to take his family life and separate it from this violent crime. The other thing that was kind of unique about Kuklinski is he seems to kill for business and pleasure. I think lots of us can understand why hitmen kill people, right? If you're engaged in the mafia or some kind of drug cartel, it kind of comes with the territory. Not to say that everybody does it, but you understand how drug dealers kill other drug dealers, criminals kill other criminals, right? But when you kill for personal reasons as well, those lines are somewhat blurred. And this is what made the Holmes kind of rethink this category. In one of the first videos, I talk about the definition of serial murder. There are competing definitions out there. I like the one that the Holmes has put forward, and it talks about you have a body count, so at least 3 bodies. You have a temporal element in that the killings have to take over 30 days in duration, so we're going 31 plus days onward up to years. And then there's these cooling down periods in between. So the idea is I engage in a murder, I then go back to my normal life, and then I engage in murder and kind of do this on and on and on until you get caught or you stop, essentially. The problem is, if you take that definition, there are all kinds of people that would fit that criteria. So maybe you take somebody like Billy the Kid or Jesse James or Al Capone, or somebody like one of the drug cartels, right? So El Chapo or someone like that. They're definitely going to have killed enough people. The temporal elements there. There's cooling down periods, but it just doesn't sit right. These aren't serial killers, right? Their motivation isn't the same. I think when most of us talk about serial killers, we have something very specific in mind. And it's people that somewhat enjoy killing. They're in it for something personal. Now, with comfort killers, it's a little bit odd because I don't know that they necessarily derive pleasure in it, but they also don't seem to care because they are sociopaths for the most part. They don't really react the same way as most of us would if a loved one died. But for better or worse, this is the hitman category here. And like I said, they originally weren't considered serial killers, but Kuklinski kind of changes the game here a little bit. And they're acting for material gain, obviously. So this is the some of the information on the hedonistic comfort killers. If we go by the crime scene, the controlled whether it's a controlled crime scene or not, the answer would be yes. Again, if you're more professional, you're going to take time to plan this. If you're killing someone you know, obviously one of the first things that the police do is look towards family, friends, relatives, known enemies, people around the victim, right? So you want to take steps to insulate yourself, and for the most part they do, and it's reflected in the controlled crime scene. They're not really going to leave a whole lot up to chance. And if the crime scene is a mess, it might be because it's deliberately made to look like it's a mess, right? So maybe you stage a burglary going wrong, maybe you stage a home invasion or whatever it might be. But the real idea is you're after that financial benefit. Overkill, for the most part, no. Again, they don't really derive any pleasure from dragging this out or torturing you or seeing the fear and apprehension in your eyes like a thrill killer would. They just simply want you dead so they can collect the money or the financial benefit. Evidence, same reasons, evidence of torture, no. Body move, no. For the most part, you want the body to be discovered, right? If you want to collect on the deceased's estate, you probably need a body to appear at some point, unless you want to go the route where they disappear and it takes you years to have them declared dead and go through probate and all that kind of stuff, which most people probably aren't that willing to wait that long. So the body is not going to be moved. You want it to be found. Specific victim, definitely, right? It's going to be someone carefully selected. This might be the most careful selection of any victim. So it's not just someone who kind of fits this physical criteria. It's going to be someone carefully selected for their financial, the financial benefits of dispatching the person, right? So it's not going to just be some random Joe Blow off the street. They're not going to come after a lowly associate professor of criminal justice. You're probably going to select someone who's well off, well established, pretty safe and secure, because that is, after all, what you're after. Relational victim, yes. And again, this is probably one of the few instances where you're going to be dealing with almost exclusively relational videos. Hitman might be the only exception of strangers if they're in the Hitman category. Other than that, it's not only going to be people you know, it's going to be people you know quite well. As far as the sexual elements, for the most part, you're really not going to see any of that stuff. And the reason is it's not what it's about. It's not about sexual gratification. Now, that doesn't mean you'll never see it. Again, if you're trying to make it appear as though maybe somebody broke in, sexually assaulted the victim, you're trying to make it look like something else happened, there may be elements of a sexual crime or sexual nature, but for the most part, you're really not going to see that. As far as, mutilation and all that, again, probably not going to see it unless, of course, it's being done to attempt to throw the police off. So, methods of murder, for the most part, going to be very planned, very organized, and it's going to be act-focused for the most part. We talked about this before, act versus process. Process is where you drag it out and kind of you get some enjoyment, derive enjoyment from the pleasure that the person goes through. Here, you're not going to see that. Now, it doesn't mean that the killing will necessarily be immediate. Again, if you poison someone, this is a slow process that's going to cause you probably significant pain. So the person may be vomiting blood or passing blood, in other ways, may have terrible stomach problems or cramps and think that something else is going on before they realize what's really happening is they're slowly being poisoned and eventually die. Now, where it will get confusing is some people would say, that's a process-focused kill because it's long and torturous to some extent. But what you got to kind of think of is they're not really interested in drawing it out. Why am I doing the slow drawn-out thing? To avoid apprehension or detection. So it's not necessarily that I want to do this. It's just the easiest path to get where you're going. Now, to make this further confusing, they may dispatch them quickly with something like a gun. Right? I mean, it could be just about any method employed because what you really want is the victim dead quickly so you can move on to that next stage of recovering whatever assets they own and making them yours. So that's kind of the methods bit. So as far as the hedonistic category, again, we kind of see we had the three distinct ones. So lust, thrill, and comfort. And if I had to boil it down into kind of like a summary slide or something like this, I would say the hedonistic lust killers, the key thing to look for is necrophilia. Okay, they enjoy the victim alive and dead. If we're dealing with hedonistic thrill, the key thing to look for is one, no necrophilia, and two, you're probably going to see a lot of damage done to the person while they're still alive. Again, why? They get sexual gratification, personal satisfaction from seeing the person suffer, pray, bargain, cry, all that kind of stuff. And then we move on to the third category, which would be the comfort killers. And the key thing here is they're in it for the money. They're not really in it to torture you, to hurt you. They'd probably be just as happy if you died very quickly so they can get the money even sooner. So they're kind of the three takeaways on each of those categories. Hey, I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you found some of it informational. Again, sorry for the long delay in turning this one out. I'm going to try to do some more videos and wrap up all this background stuff so I can get into making actual videos about serial killers. I'm probably going to try to focus on lesser known killers. I don't think there's a whole lot I can tell you about Jeffrey Dahmer or John Wayne Gacy. You probably haven't seen 58 times already on the million videos that have been made about those folks. So I'll probably try to focus on some more local killers or people that haven't received as much, fanfare or attention on the interwebs here. So thanks for your time. I hope you appreciate it, and I hope to see you all back in the next video. Take care. Cheers.